October 1813. The fields around Leipzig and Saxony trembled beneath the tramp of armies. Smoke from countless campfires coiled into the autumn sky, and the thunder of hooves and wagons echoed across the land. Here in the heart of Germany, the fate of Napoleon's empire would be decided. The battle that was to come would not be one of nations alone, but of Europe itself, a clash so vast it would forever be remembered as the Battle of Nations. For over a decade, Napoleon Bonaparte had ruled the continent through a mixture of brilliance, ambition, and fear. From the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt to the snows of Russia, his eagles had flown, scattering coalitions and toppling thrones. Yet the tide had turned. His disastrous Russian campaign in 1812 had cost him the heart of his Grande Armée, and though he raised new forces, they were young, raw, and weary of war. Austria, long cowed into submission, now stood ready to avenge its defeats. Prussia, humiliated at Jena and crushed at Tilsit, rose again, with renewed fury, its soldiers hungry for redemption. Russia, bloodied but unbroken, marched westward in pursuit of vengeance. And Sweden, under the leadership of former French Marshal Bernadotte, joined the cause against its old master. Leipzig was the point where all these rivers of fate converged. Napoleon sought to strike a decisive blow before the Allies could overwhelm him with numbers. His army, around 190,000 strong, was formidable, but stretched thin, bolstered by reluctant allies like the Saxons and the Poles. Against him, the Allies gathered nearly 500,000 men, a host unprecedented in European history. Kings and emperors rode at their head, determined to end the reign of its fields, villages, and ridges would soon be transformed into a furnace of steel and fire. For the people of Leipzig, the week ahead would bring not the bustle of trade and harvest, but the roar of cannon, the crush of armies, and the unending shadow of death. Thus, as October dawned, Napoleon faced the gravest trial of his career. Surrounded by enemies, betrayed by wavering allies, and commanding an army that could not match the sheer weight of Europe united, he prepared to fight not merely for victory, but for survival. The Battle of Leipzig was about to begin, and with it, the fate of an empire. By the early autumn of 1813, the chessboard of Europe was set. Napoleon's new army, rebuilt with astonishing speed, assembled in Saxony. The emperor himself took command at Dresden, where he tried to hold the center of Germany against the converging storm. Yet his ranks, once filled with hardened veterans of Austerlitz and Wagram, now marched with boys scarce many had never fired a musket in battle. They would learn soon enough. Across the borders, the coalition prepared with grim determination. Russian columns, hardened from the campaign of 1812, pushed steadily west. Prussia poured out its vengeance. Landwehr militias, in rough uniforms, marched alongside veterans driven by a fury that had smoldered since their humiliation at Jena. Austria, after months of hesitation, now fully committed, sending masses of white-coated regiments north toward Saxony. Even Sweden, under Crown Prince Bernadotte, once Napoleon's marshal, brought its armies southward, a betrayal that cut deep into the emperor's pride. The marches were staggering in scale. Villages shook under the tramp of tens of thousands, rivers clogged with bridges of men and wagons, fields churned to mud beneath hooves and cannon wheels. Drums echoed from dawn until dusk horns carried signals across valleys, and every road in Central Europe seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of war. For civilians caught in the path, terror reigned. Refugees flooded the countryside, farmers with ox-drawn carts piled with bedding mothers, clutching children, livestock driven into forests to escape requisition. Church bells tolled in warning as the smoke of campfires and burning farms rose across the Saxon horizon. Leipzig, once a city of merchants and scholars, became the unwilling heart of a gathering tempest. Napoleon moved swiftly. He struck at Dresden in late August, defeating the Allies in a brilliant counterblow. But the victory was fleeting. His enemies no longer risked destruction in a single clash. They withdrew, regrouped, and encircled him with ever-growing armies. Slowly, inexorably, the circle tightened around Leipzig. By October, over 500,000 men were on the move toward the city, the greatest concentration of force Europe had ever seen. Napoleon, outnumbered but defiant, resolved to stand and fight. The march was over. The preparations were complete. The world's gaze turned to Saxony, where the fate of an empire would soon be decided. By mid-October 1813, the storm Napoleon had tried to outrun finally closed around him. At Leipzig, the noose of Europe drew tight. From every direction, vast Allied armies pressed inward, Russians from the east, Prussians from the north, Austrians from the south, and Bernadotte's Swedes from the northwest. Napoleon, once the master of maneuver, now found himself trapped at the crossroads of Saxony, with fewer than 200,000 men against an enemy twice his size. The city of Leipzig groaned under the strain, its streets choked with French soldiers, supply wagons, wounded men, and terrified civilians. The booming of distant cannon drew closer each day, shaking windows and rattling church bells. Refugees poured into cellars, praying the city's ancient walls might hold back. The roads to the west, his only lifeline, were threatened. His German allies, Saxons, Bavarians, Württembergers, grew restless, their loyalty wavering as coalition envoys whispered promises of freedom. The emperor had built his empire on speed and daring, but here in the plains of Saxony, he would be forced into the kind of grinding battle he had always tried to avoid. The Allies, too, felt the weight of the coming clash. Though they vastly outnumbered the French, they knew the man they faced. Napoleon had crushed them time and again when odds seemed impossible. Around their campfires, generals argued strategy deep into the night, fearful of walking into yet another trap. But this time was different. The armies of Europe had learned. They would not fight Napoleon alone, but as one. On October 16th, the guns thundered. From the south, Austrian columns surged forward across open fields. To the north, Prussians pressed hard, their drums beating vengeance. In the east, Russian lines advanced through the morning mist, banners of St. Andrew rising above the smoke. Leipzig shuddered as the greatest battle the world had yet seen erupted in every direction. For Napoleon, this was the crisis of his reign, a battle not of choice, but of survival. Surrounded, betrayed, outnumbered, he stood at the heart of Europe with the empire he had forged, now crumbling around him. The Battle of Nations had begun, and with it, the slow breaking of the man who once seemed invincible. On the morning of October 16, 1813, the thunder of cannon shook the earth. The Battle of Leipzig had begun. Across a front stretching for miles, nearly 500,000 men clashed in what would become the largest battle Europe had ever seen. To the south, Austrian armies surged across the flat farmlands, their white-coated infantry advancing through the smoke of burning villages. French cannons tore gaps in their lines, but the Austrians pressed forward relentlessly, drums, hammering banners whipping in the wind. On the northern plain, the Prussians attacked with fury. Their cries of Vorwärts echoed like rolling thunder as they hurled themselves against French positions, driven by years of humiliation and the burning desire for vengeance. In the east, the Russian juggernaut moved through the morning fog. Columns of infantry, their icons glinting in the pale light, advanced with grim determination. Their artillery roared, sending shells crashing into French redoubts. French conscripts, many barely trained, fired desperately from hastily prepared defenses. They fought bravely, but the weight of the Allied assault was crushing. At the center, Napoleon's command was a whirlwind of activity. From a hill overlooking Leipzig, he rode between batteries directing his marshals to counterattack. Cuirassiers thundered forward in gleaming armor sabers flashing as they clashed with Austrian and Russian cavalry in a storm of steel and dust. Time and again, Napoleon hurled his troops into the fray, holding back the tide with sheer willpower and the memory of his past triumphs. The battle raged for hours, shifting like a great storm. Villages changed hands multiple times, streets and fields littered with the dead and dying. The air was thick with smoke and the unceasing roar of muskets, cannon, and drums. Civilians cowered in cellars as walls shook and roofs collapsed above them. Despite their courage, the French were stretched to breaking. The Allies had the numbers, and for once, they had the coordination. Waves of fresh troops replaced the fallen, while Napoleon's army grew thinner with every charge. By nightfall, neither side had achieved a decisive breakthrough, but the French line bent under. The battle was not yet decided, but it was clear Napoleon faced not one army, but the combined might of Europe. And for the first time, his genius alone might not be enough. October 18, 1813, the second day of the great struggle, brought the battle to its breaking point. By dawn, the circle around Leipzig had drawn tighter. From north, south, and east, Allied forces pressed inward like a tightening vice. Napoleon's army, exhausted yet unyielding, stood against the greatest concentration of power Europe had ever mustered. The fighting was fiercest in the southern villages of Probstheida and Wachau. There, French troops dug in among stone houses and gardens, turning every wall into a fortress. Waves of Austrian and Russian infantry surged forward, only to be repelled by volleys of musket fire and countercharges of French cuirassiers. The ground became a charnel house soaked in blood and littered with shattered cannon. Probstheida changed hands multiple times, each assault met with staggering casualties. To the north, the Prussians struck with relentless fury. Their drums and battle cries thundered as they stormed French redoubts again and again. The young French conscripts fought desperately, their muskets flashing through clouds of smoke, but each hour brought more Prussians to the fight. Slowly, yard by yard, the defenders were pushed back. At the heart of the storm, Napoleon himself directed the battle from a hill overlooking Leipzig. Surrounded by marshals and aides, he hurled reserves wherever the line buckled. Imperial Guard infantry advanced with iron discipline, their volleys cutting down Allied ranks. For a moment, it seemed as though the Emperor might yet seize victory from the jaws of disaster. But then came betrayal. In the midst of battle, entire Saxon regiments, once Napoleon's allies, suddenly turned their guns upon the French. Their standards dipped, their muskets fired into the backs of their former comrades. The shock rippled through the French ranks like lightning. Confusion spread, morale cracked, and the fragile balance of the battlefield shattered. The Allies seized their moment. Russian, Austrian, and Prussian forces surged forward with renewed fury, their banners rising over smoke and flame. Napoleon's army bent beneath the weight, fighting with courage, but now hopelessly outmatched. By nightfall, Leipzig itself was engulfed in fire. The Emperor's eagle, once a symbol of unstoppable conquest, was cornered. For the first time in his career, Napoleon faced not just defeat, but the collapse of his empire. The climax had come. The Battle of Nations was turning against him. On October 19th, as dawn broke over the smoking ruins of Leipzig, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What remained of his battered army streamed westward through the city, columns of exhausted men stumbling over rubble and streets clogged with wagons, cannon wounded, and refugees. The once proud Grande Armée, reduced to a shadow of its former might, was now fighting only to escape. Yet even in retreat, disaster struck. At the single bridge across the Elster River, the only lifeline out of the city, chaos reigned. Crowds of soldiers and civilians pressed together in desperation while Allied artillery fire rained down. In a moment of confusion, French engineers detonated the bridge too early. Thousands were trapped on the far side, cut off from salvation. Many drowned in the river, others were slaughtered by advancing Allied troops. The retreat became a rout, and the French army's cohesion dissolved in the smoke of catastrophe. For the Allies, victory was complete. Over 600,000 men had taken part in the Battle of Nations. Nearly 100,000 lay dead wounded or captured, the heaviest toll Europe had yet seen in a single battle. Napoleon. The man who had dominated the continent for nearly 2 decades was forced into a retreat that would end in France itself. The political consequences were immediate. Germany rose against French rule as states like Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony abandoned Napoleon. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed. Austria reasserted itself as a great power. Prussia, bloodied but unbroken, claimed its rebirth. And Russia, fresh from the ashes of 1812, stood as the unbending force of the coalition. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Leipzig was unity. For the first time, Europe had stood together not in fragments, but as one to crush the domination of a single man. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was broken forever. Within 6 months, the Allies would march into Paris itself, forcing the emperor to abdicate. The Battle of Leipzig was not merely a military defeat. It was the death knell of an empire. It marked the beginning of the end for the Napoleonic dream, and the birth of a new Europe shaped not by one man's ambition, but by the blood of nations united. This was the legacy of Leipzig, the battle that ended an age of conquest and heralded the dawn of a new world order.